So let me go ahead and introduce the program. I want to thank you all for joining the Darien Library this evening. We have a tour of the Mount, Edith Wharton's elegant estate in Lenox, Massachusetts. Edith designed this beautiful estate with the same passion she brought to her written words. We are lucky to have Anne Schuyler, Director of Visitor Services, hosting this tour. Anne has been with the Mount since 2006 and is a proud graduate of the University of Virginia, as well as attending Northeastern University. Anne also grew up in Darien. Yay! So welcome back, Anne. We'd like to thank our friends at the Darien Library for the support of these programs. I'd also like to remind you all that you can type your questions, into the Q&A box, and we'll take them at the end. So let me step away, and Anne will take over, and you're about to enter a beautiful world of the Mount. Thank you, everyone.
So I hope everybody can hear me. All right, my name is Anne Schuyler, and yes, I did grow up in Darien, Connecticut, so this is great fun for me. What I'm going to do first is just go through a slideshow on kind of the history of the Mount and a little bit about Edith Wharton, and then we're going to switch to a virtual tour that we did yesterday, so you can see exactly what the Mount looks like today. But to give you a little bit of background, the Mount was the home of Edith Wharton, great American author who lived there from 1902 until 1911. So who was Edith Wharton? Well, Edith Wharton was the author of over 40 books, written in over 40 years. She wrote the books that she's most well known for are novels, specifically The House of Mirth, which she wrote in 1905 while she was living at the Mount. The Age of Innocence, which you may have heard of. That is the one she won the Pulitzer Prize for in 1921. She was the first woman to win a Pulitzer Prize for a work of fiction. She also wrote the New England classic, Ethan Frome, which I think I read in Darien High School, I'm not sure, but if you haven't read it for a while, I urge you to read it again. Those are what we sort of call up here her big three novels, but she actually wrote, as I said, over 40 books in 40 years, and not just novels, but short stories, some great ghost stories, travel works, nonfiction, things like that. So what we're going to talk about here primarily is her relationship to her house and a book that she wrote called The Decoration of Houses. But let's start at her beginning. She was born in 1862. She was born in New York City. Her maiden name was Edith Newbold Jones, and she seemed to have an affinity for flowers and beauty from a very young age. This is a lovely oil painted by a name named Frederick May in 1867. She was the daughter of George Frederick Jones, and Lucretia Rhinelander Jones. Lucretia Rhinelander Jones, her mother, her mama, was reputedly one of the best dressed society matrons in New York. They probably wanted their very precocious daughter to grow up to take her place in New York society. Her daughter was this incredible intellectual almost from day one, and they were probably a little perplexed by her. But she also had two older brothers, Harry on the right and Frederick on the left. They were quite a bit older than she was. They were 12 and 16 years older than she was. So she really grew up almost like an only child. And you think about that as the background for a writer. She grew up extremely observant. And she also grew up mainly in Europe. Her parents took her to Europe at the age of 4. And from the age 4 to age 10, they wandered around the great cities of Europe, primarily Italy, France, southern Germany. She picked up the languages. She was very adept at languages. She picked up a lifelong love of European art, aesthetics, culture, architecture. She also picked up typhoid fever, got quite ill. Her parents brought her back to New York City at age 10. Now, this is a picture of her childhood home, 14 West 23rd Street. I'm sure some of you make it into the city now and then. If you go there now, you can visit her childhood home and have a cup of coffee because it's now a Starbucks. But as I said, she actually didn't spend a whole lot of time as a young girl in that house, but she did spend time as a teenager. She also spent time as a teenager in the family summer cottage, a place called Pencraig in Newport. And she had actually very fond memories of her summers in Newport. They were a little less structured at the time anyway than New York life. But her primary job, oh, this is one of my favorite drawings of Edith Wharton, actually. She knew from the very beginning that she wanted to be a writer. She was also a very good artist. And this is a self-portrait that she drew when she was 14 years old in 1876. And you can see she already knew what was important to her, a pen and a book. And there's a story actually that her mother would relate to people about the young Edith Wharton, and that Edith Wharton would write about in her own autobiography. She said that even before she knew how to read, she would walk around the room with a book, often held upside down because she couldn't read yet. She was that young, and make up stories. She was compelled to what she called make up, even to the point at one point at her own birthday party, she told her mother to go entertain the guests because she had to go make up. It wasn't like she was doing it for an audience, doing it for people. It was some compulsion, inner compulsion that she felt she had to do. So she knew that she wanted to be a writer of some sort, probably from the very beginning. Luckily, she was helped a great deal. She never had formal education. She never went away to school. Her brothers both went to some of the great universities of the day. One went to Columbia, I think one went to Cambridge. But she was a girl, and so she was schooled at home. It wasn't thought she had to have such an extensive education, but she was very lucky to have her mother hired for her a governess named Anna Catherine Ballman, who was a German immigrant herself, and who joined Edith Wharton when she was, Edith Jones, then when she was only 12 years old. And they embarked on this incredible regime of reading everything they could get their hands on, particularly German literature. She was an early fan of Goethe and Faust, and because Anna Catherine Ballman was schooled in the German literature, but just a voracious intellectual appetite. However, if you were a young lady growing up in the 1880s, 1870s in New York, your primary job was to get married. So Edith Jones came out into the society as a debutante at age 17, and she got fairly quickly engaged to a man named Harry Stevens. And this is Harry Stevens' mother, a woman named Mrs. Perrin Stevens. She's all dressed up for a ball. I think it was the famous Astor Ball or something like that. So she didn't normally look like that. But she was new money, and the Joneses considered themselves old money. Her family, her husband owned a very fancy hotel on Fifth Avenue, and so the mothers really clashed. The potential, the mother and the mother-in-law really clashed, and they actually called the whole thing off. So Edith, at age 19 or something like that, became unengaged. At 20, became disengaged because the mothers didn't get along and argued. They also thought Edith was too bookish and too intellectual for their son. So anyway, here she is, and she is 1920, unmarried. She goes up to Bar Harbor, Maine, and spends some time with these two men. And I just want to mention them because they're very important figures in her life. One of my guides on the tour, they'll always say she spent some time with these two men. One she called the love of all her life, and the other one she married. And the one she married was Teddy Wharton over here on the right with the bowler. And the one she would call the love of all her life is this very distinguished gentleman over here on the top left named Walter Van Rensselaer Berry. And they seemed to really click when they met in Bar Harbor when she was 21 years old. But he went away to Washington, D.C. to pursue his legal career and never proposed. So now it's getting a little worrisome. Her mother is getting quite worried that she's not going to get married. So Teddy Wharton is very persistent. That's him on the right here. He proposes, she accepts, and they get married in 1885. Teddy Wharton is quite a bit older than Edith is. He is 35 when they get married. Edith is 23. Not one of her better looks, actually. We never can figure out if this is a dog or a cat or something on top of the hat. But you can also see Lucretia, her mother, here in the middle, looking very stern by this time. Actually, Lucretia was very fond of Teddy in the beginning. So they get engaged in 1884 in Newport, as I said, and they get married in 1885 at Trinity Chapel, West 25th Street in New York. Burned down a few years ago. Some of you might be familiar with that, but fairly modest wedding, actually. Teddy Wharton's family had a history of mental illness. They really didn't understand it at the time, but at the time of their wedding, Teddy Wharton's father had committed himself to McLean's Hospital, the psychiatric hospital outside of Boston. And so that might have been one of the reasons why it was a fairly quiet wedding. It was in the chapel, not in like Grace Church or one of the larger churches in New York that Edith Wharton would set so many of her novels at. After their marriage, their first married home was Pencraig Cottage, which was a cottage on her mother's estate. Her father, Edith's father, had died by this time. So setting up your first household on your mother's estate. Luckily, Edith came into some money when she was 28 years old. A relative she barely knew died and gave her what today would probably close to almost $2 million. And so she bought this house in Newport called Land's End. It's right on the water, beautiful. Most people would love it. She called it an ugly wooden house on a piece of rock and set about redoing it. And I think we always think that that's where she, it was a creative outlet for her. She really wasn't yet writing. She wasn't very healthy, as you can tell from this picture of her in her 20s, right after she got married, her 20s, even up until her early 30s. She seemed to suffer some sort of perhaps depression, but also just physical diseases. She wasn't very healthy, very happy. But she put a lot of creative energy into redoing her Newport house. She hired a young architect from Boston named Ogden Codman Jr., and he helped her redo her Newport house. And in the process of redoing the house, they discovered they had a lot of things in common in terms of architectural ideas and design principles. So they decided to write a book together. It's called The Decoration of Houses. It was published in 1897. It actually is Edith Wharton's first major published work. So we think of her as a novelist, but in fact, her first major work was a work about interior design, essentially, and architecture, and that's what she became known as initially. She was the young Mrs. Edith Wharton, who was an architect and a design expert. What they were rebelling against, and what Edith particularly was rebelling against, was what her mother had. This was her mother's drawing room in New York about in the 1880s or so. And you can see just the multiple curtains, just a little bit of light coming through, but all that chintz and just way excess. And what Edith and her architect, Ogden Codman Jr., was doing was actually returning to a much more classical, restrained sort of style, influenced by the 18th century as much as it was by the 19th century. And this is the stair hall at Land's End, her Newport house, after they did the renovation. And you can see how architecturally cleaner it is. The principles that she would write about in terms of what she did like an architect were principles of symmetry, principles of balance, modesty, moderation. And those are some of the principles that she built into the Mount when she came to build the Mount, which we'll talk about when we do the virtual tour. But this hallway actually has many characteristics that are very similar to our hallway, all our hallways here at the Mount. So anyway, she redid her Newport house, quite expensive redo, wrote this book, and then grew tired of Newport. Her husband liked Newport. He was a great tennis player and athlete, but Edith didn't like the weather, and she didn't like the very confining social atmosphere that she felt in Newport. You really couldn't do anything, and she wanted the ability to concentrate on her writing. So she and her husband came out to Lenox in 1899 or so. Her husband's family had known Lenox for quite a while. They had actually summered out here. Lenox was rustic, but it was still a resort that a lot of the same people who lived in Newport and New York went to. It was kind of on the circuit. But this lower picture is quite remarkable because it shows Teddy Wharton here. Edith Wharton is up on top of the hill. And of course, a little dog is in between, because one thing you'll learn from this, if you don't know it already, is that Edith Wharton loved dogs, as did Teddy. But they're actually siting the house, and the top picture is what it looks like now, but they cited the location for the house. So they started building the house in July of 1901, and they moved in September of 1902. It only took them 15 months to build the house, and this is an early postcard from that period. You can see the gardeners. The gardener is still working down here in the trenches. The landscape's not finished, but it gives you a lovely idea of, again, the principles they were working off of: symmetry, balance, and proportion. Very classic architecture. They actually ended up hiring an additional architect named Francis L.V. Hoppin to do the exterior of the house. He had worked for the firm of McKim, Mead and White, which some of you might have heard of. Who they did a lot of the big public buildings, Boston Public Library, things like that. And the Mount is actually inspired by an English country house called Belton House, built in 1683. And you can see some of the similarities: the central cupola, the pediment. Those are things that were brought over to the Mount. This is Hoppin's plans for that side. One very significant addition that the Whartons insisted on was this big, almost wraparound terrace with the double plating style staircases. Wharton loved the Renaissance. She loved Italian Renaissance. So some of these architectural ideas would have come from Italian Renaissance ideas. This is what the Mount looked like when it first started out in 1902. The front of the house. This is actually the front of the house, and we'll see the current view when we actually do the tour. The front of the house is quite spare. Some people think it's sort of severe. The fancier part of the house, the more gracious part of the house, is actually the back of the house, or the garden side of the house. And we'll see that as we go through the tour. So the last slide that I'm going to show before we go into the actual virtual tour is what this house looked like in 1997. The Mount went through multiple owners. It was part of a girls' school for a period of time. It was used by an acting group called Shakespeare Company for a period of time. But by 1997, it was in pretty bad shape. And so that's when the current restoration that you'll see when we do the tour really started. The major part of the restoration happened between about 1998 and 2002. The Albany paper, I think, ran a headline on this particular picture that said it's like a white elephant, a dying white elephant. We're actually quite lucky that it wasn't taken down, although by that time it had been put on the Historic Registry of Historic Places, thankfully. So it was somewhat protected, but it was in very rough shape, as you can see. So I'm going to stop sharing my slideshow right now and make hopefully a smooth switch to the video. Okay, so ta-da! Here we have the Mount as of yesterday, and that same rather severe front. That is the front of the house. And a couple of things that we'll look at as we look at the front of the house. A lot of people are surprised that it is so fairly simple, but that was part of the philosophy, that the front of the house should be elegant but restrained, and the back of the house is where the gracious arms, I always talk about sort of as the gracious arms of the estate, open up and envelop you. It is a wooden house with a stucco finish. So all that bright white is actually stucco that's in remarkably good shape. Again, we did have to do a lot of restuccoing work when we did the restoration. And it is a 4-story house on the front of the house and a 3-story house on the back of the house. Now, Edith Wharton loved symmetry. She loved balance. She loved proportion. And yet you will notice by where we are right now in the video that there is a whole wing to the right of the house that makes the house technically not symmetrical. And that's the service wing. It was put there on purpose. A lot of houses, it's where the kitchen is and the pantry and things like that. It's not where the servants actually live, but it's the working part of the house. A lot of big houses at that time, they might have put the those rooms down in the basement where there's no light and no air. I'm sure some of you remember Downton Abbey, where the servants actually had to, their working area was down in the basement. And they didn't do that. They just set it back a few paces and sort of hid it a little bit, disguised it by setting it back so that your eye is focused, or your eye should be focused on the very front of the house. And yet even on the front of the house, there are a few other little illusions that you'll see having to do with those shutters. Those shutters that are shut are always shut. There's no glass and there's no windows on the other side of those shutters. Part of the windows actually either go into the retaining wall that helps hold the house up, or in some cases they open up onto a bathroom, something that you would never actually want anybody to see. We're going to pause here right in the middle so you can see one of the other kind of neat illusions, if you would, on the front of the house. Kind of hard to see probably from the video, but if you look over the window over that front door, you will see, you might see just a little bit of a reflection of greenery, a little bit of green or a little bit of light. And when you're here in person, it looks for all the world like you're actually looking through the house to the other side, and that it's a very narrow little house. But in fact, you'll see when we go inside the house, it's a very cleverly placed mirror that exactly reflects the panes of the window and the trees in back of you. So we'll see that more when we go inside the house. If you also take a brief look up at the top, you'll see where those dormers are and the awnings, and that's where the servants live. The female servant lived on the top floor of the house. There are 8 little bedrooms on, well, actually, they're not too, yeah, they're little bedrooms. On the top floor of the house with 1 bathroom. And the male servants and the married servants lived over the stable. So if you ever come up here, hopefully you will see the magnificent stables, and that's where they live. Now we're going to pan around here to the forecourt so you get a sense of the somewhat enclosed area. This really is a circular driveway, if you would. The Whartons would come down in their horse and carriages or their auto cars. They had both. Teddy Wharton was a huge fan of the early automobile, and Edith was too. She liked speed, so she would. They bought an auto car as soon as it was possible. So here we're going into the front door of the house. We're going into the entrance hallway, and the first thing that you see, and they would have kept these doors open much of the time. The first thing that you see is the statue of the god Pan. It's a bronze by a sculptor named Frederick McMonnies, who is a very famous and very popular 19th century, end of the 19th century sculpture. And this sculpture here was originally a fountain, and it actually worked. The Whartons were very advanced technologically. They had hot and cold running water. They had heat. Even though it was a summer house, they actually had a coal burning furnace. And they had electricity because a man named George Westinghouse happened to live next door, literally next door. But so this room that we're in is the entrance hallway. I'll stop it just briefly. And it is a very practical room where the butler, the footman would have met you and taken your coat or your wrap and then escorted you upstairs. It is specifically designed to look like an Italian grotto. So that's why you have the terracotta floors, you have the plaster work on the walls that is designed to look like dripping moss or dripping water. So we're following our butler here in virtual reality up the stairs to the main level, built on a very European concept where the main rooms really start on the second floor. That door that led off to where all that rough wood was the door to the servants' part of the house. So we're going up the stairs. Some of the things like the banister that we just bumped into is original, was made, custom made for them in Paris. It's wrought iron, made in Paris. And then these are some of the pictures that we have. We have 15 original paintings left in the house. And I'll pause this one. They're all like this one. They're inset into the wall. They're meant to be decorative. They're not signed. We don't even know who painted them. But they were meant to set the mood for the room or for the house. And in this particular case, Wharton was a great fan of sort of 18th century Rococo style. This is sort of in the French Watteau-like painting of beautiful people enjoying their country house. As I said when we were downstairs, this house was primarily a summer house, but the summers for Wharton were quite long. They would be here as early as April, and they might not leave until September, or actually November or December. We're in the gallery now, which is the main foyer, the meet and greet place that was not downstairs. So this is where really the main part of the house opens up. The hardware on the doors and windows there is original. The floors are original. The furniture is not original. And that's because Wharton only lived here for 10 years and then sold the house and took the furniture with her to France. But here we're panning up and you can see the mirror that is visible from outside, and it's still doing its work. It's still reflecting light and air. This was a big difference from Wharton's, the houses she had grown up with. So this floor, I'll stop it right here just so we talk a little bit about the floor. This is called Travaso marble. It's an Italian technique with local material. So the Whartons were wealthy, but not anywhere near as wealthy as some of their friends and neighbors. So a few places they cut a few corners in this house. And the floor is one. Probably some of you have gone to elementary schools that had that same type of floor. It's marble chip in a cement base with a high gloss put on it. Very practical, very easy to clean, but very beautiful, and particularly in this design. Some of the best marble in the house is actually the marble around the baseboards. That's why we were panning that. That's Italian imported marble. But this whole sense of light and air and arches is something that was influenced. Wharton was influenced by her experience in Italy and France, and she chose the architects that she chose, you know, had to have that same feeling. This is a historic photo of what this room looked like when the Whartons were here. So again, not a lot of furniture. This is not a place where you could spend a whole lot of time. Double doors. She loved doors. Edith Wharton wrote in her book, The Decoration of Houses, that the primary purpose of a door is to include, its secondary purpose is to exclude. So you can really change the character of the room and the house that you're in by whether or not you have the doors open or not. And as I said, they were here in pretty cold weather, so some of that was purely practical. A note about the colors while we're looking at the arches. The colors are very close to the original. We did have a designer show house here in 2002, and I can talk about that a little bit later, where they were given a little bit of leeway in terms of the colors, but she loved pastels, used a lot of stucco on the interior. She writes about that in the decoration of houses. All right, so here you see those double doors down at the end of the hall, lovely Palladian style arch on top. We're going to spin around here. And you'll see at the other end of the hall, you have these double doors, lovely arch on top. The arch on top actually has bas relief, which is original to the house. That's a marble bas relief done in the Italian style of Della Robbia. That's supposed to be John the Baptist. Again, Della Robbia was a favorite of Wharton and a favorite of sort of that time period. So we're walking into Teddy Wharton's den, her husband's den. And what you thought was a double door, which we almost ran into there, is in fact a single door. So from the outside, from the gallery, you want it to look like a double door, but on the inside, we're inside Teddy Wharton's den. The room is way too small to support the proportions of a double door. Wharton was very serious about proper proportions, and it's one of the things that affect people the most when they come here. All right, now we're looking at the devil dog. The devil dog. That's Teddy Wharton again with the dogs. All those poor dogs are buried out in the pet cemetery. They adored dogs. They were definitely members of the family. Teddy Wharton's den was a very private, nice little room for him, actually. All the major public rooms have marble fireplaces. Again, the paintings that are inset into the walls are supposed to tell you what type of room it is. Teddy had his own bathroom. That's what that door led to. It's the only room on the second, it's the only room on the second floor that has its own bathroom. The rest of the bathrooms were all up on the third floor. And he has his own route out onto the terrace. So if he wanted to escape his wife's intellectual companions. And then we have a rather unghostly entrance into the library, connected by a concealed door. Now, the library is my favorite room in the house because what you're looking at are Edith Wharton's actual books. So I think I mentioned earlier that Wharton left the house in 1911. Her marriage with her husband was breaking up. He had a couple of affairs. She had an affair. He sort of borrowed some money from her trust fund and set himself up in Boston with another woman. So the marriage was breaking up. They left the house. She moved to France. She lived in France until age 75. She died in 1937. She had about 5,000 books at the time. Part of her collection she willed to her godson, a young man named Colin Clark, who was only 6 years old at the time. And it was stored in the Clark family library. Colin Clark was the son of Sir Kenneth Clark, very famous British art historian. So the book stayed in the Clark family library for about 2 decades, and then were eventually returned to us, well, we bought them from a British bookseller in 2004. So these books have only been on the shelf since about 2005. They were fairly expensive for us, but they're an incredible asset. They tell us things about her intellect, her reading curiosity, which was enormous. She wrote and spoke in 5 different languages: French, German, Italian, Old English, or Anglo-Saxon. And that brings me to the what we're looking at right now, which is the fireplace and the firebacks. The firebacks are elements in all of the rooms, and they are decorative panels that also reflect heat back into the room. And the fireback in the library is very appropriately an image of Beowulf. Beowulf was one of Edith Wharton's favorite works of literature. Wharton was also very adamant that what a library should look like. She insisted on inset shelves, movable shelves, and that the books themselves should be the centerpiece of the library in this lovely tapestry-like effect. And also in terms of the carving on the wall, that is original. The carving, the decorative carving done on these walls is quarter sawn American oak, something that's very hard to do these days because it comes from very large trees. And it was designed by her architect, Ogden Codman Jr., who worked on the interior work at the Mount in the style of Grinling Gibbons, who some of you might know was a 17th century English architect and designer who worked with Sir Christopher Wren. And we're looking right now, we'll get a better picture of this in one of the other rooms of one of the paintings on the wall. The books, she didn't write in her library, which is kind of interesting. She wrote in her bedroom upstairs. The books, by the way, they're like people would give her books. So we have wonderful inscriptions by people like Henry James and Theodore Roosevelt. Her own books are here as well. We have her pen, which is what you're looking at right now, one of her fountain pens. We don't have a lot of her personal stuff, so anytime we get a pen or something like that, it's very important to us. So this, for instance, is one of the books that Theodore Roosevelt gave to her, America in the World War. And you can read the inscriptions, I hope. It says, "To Edith Wharton from an American, exclamation point, Theodore Roosevelt, 1915. They were actually pretty good friends, particularly around the war, the World War I years. They were both trying to get America into the war. Edith Wharton by this time was in Paris and really advocating for America to join the French War, effort. The man above the mantle is actually the other architect that I sort of talked about, Frances L.V. Hoppin. Now that's not original to the house. She didn't have a picture of her architect over her mantle. She had a picture of a very English lord that she took with her when she went to France. And this is something that we're quite proud of and excited about. As I said, we don't really have a lot of her things, her personal items, but we have recently acquired a box from France of things that we actually think are Edith Wharton's jacket. So we think that was Wharton's jacket and Wharton's purse. And that's Frances L.V. Hoppin, as I said, the architect of the house. So we're going to scroll around now and get to the final picture in the library, which is of Edith Wharton in 1905, the year she wrote The House of Mirth. It's a publicity picture. And when people are here, I always ask them if we think that she looked very happy, and everybody says no. And that's true because she is wearing a corset, which would make anybody miserable, and she's pretending to write in her library. She never actually wrote in her library. She used her library to entertain, to read. She and Henry James would read poetry late into the night. She wrote in her bedroom upstairs. One would never take a picture of a lady in her bedroom upstairs. So she's just posing and pretending to write in her library. Plus, some people think she had bad teeth. She never seemed to smile as a young woman. The House of Mirth, by the way, as I think I said earlier, was her breakthrough blockbuster novel. It's the one that made her a famous author. And after that, she was known as Edith Wharton, the famous novelist. So it was a real change in her life. Now we're going into the drawing room, and you might see some modern things in the drawing room. The day we were filming this, we happened to be having a meeting in the drawing room, so I apologize for that, but we have to be very practical. The drawing room is the largest room in the house. It is, some of you might know, drawing room actually is short for withdrawing room. It comes from an old medieval custom of the ladies withdrawing after dinner and leaving the men to their cigars and port. It's not Edith Wharton's piano. She did play the piano, but we don't know if she had one actually at the Mount. This, the black and white photo will show you what this room looked like when she was here. So when we did the designer show house in 2002, we tried, the people who redid the rooms replicated that couch almost exactly. And the color in this room, that blue-gray color, is actually very close, we believe, to the original color. I mentioned when we first started that the house went through periods of great neglect. It was unoccupied for a period of time. And the ceiling, which is a beautiful piece of ceiling, almost was totally destroyed when there was a water pipe that burst on the floor above. And as part of the restoration, we had to find a master plasterer, really from the Newport area, who was able to come in and do do the restoration work. The fireplace in this room is also actually quite magnificent, a big piece of probably French marble. So we are now heading into the dining room, and you will notice that the dining room is very, very light. There was a belief in the day that natural light aided digestion. So they wanted your dining room to be particularly light so everybody would have excellent digestion. Round tables, never more than 6 to 8 people. There's only 2 guest bedrooms in this house. So her style of entertaining was quite intimate, and she liked to have wonderful chatty conversation with Henry James and people like that. There is, where we are, there is no, yeah, there we go. Okay, no chandelier, no overhead lighting in this room. Overhead lighting was still quite harsh, and she thought overhead lighting was not complimentary to a lady's complexion. So no overhead lighting. Wonderful plaster work in this room. This is a eating room again. So all the plaster work actually, let me see if I can. All the plaster work actually has fruit and fowl and fish in the motif itself, because it's a food room and you were supposed to decorate a room by what you did in here. She did not like the idea of a great room that some of us have today, or was popular even then. Because how would you decorate? You had to know the function of the room, and the still life, even the still life in the dining room, all have fish and fowl and fruit motifs. That was a very strong belief of hers. And a Greek statue or two. This painting actually that we're looking at is overpainted. There's actually 2 paintings in this, but none of them, we don't really know anything about either of those paintings. The doorway that we're looking at now leads to the servants' part of the house, and that always would have been closed. So before we go upstairs, or actually we're going to go out onto the terrace, another look at one of the marble fireplaces. This is a French marble. And a fireback. This is one of the firebacks we can't identify. So if anybody's really up on their Greek or Roman mythology, has any ideas what that might be, let us know. And again, the fish and fowl and fruit. All right, now we're going to go outside to the terrace. As I say, one of the highlights of the house. The Whartons insisted on building this terrace, and there was even a newspaper article at the time that said there were 16,000 bricks put into this terrace initially. Obviously, we've had to restore a lot of those over there. It's in a wonderful herringbone pattern with marble balustrade around the side. Edith Wharton designed the gardens along with her niece, Beatrix Jones Farren. Some of you might know that name. Beatrix Jones Farren went on to be one of the first and foremost female landscape architects in this country. Designed gardens at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., Yale, Princeton, worked for Mrs. Woodrow Wilson in the Rose Garden. So her niece was very talented, and she was up here helping her Aunt Edith as she was building these gardens. The gardens are really split into 3 sections, so to speak. Down, what we're looking at right now is the Italian garden on the right, sunken, cloistered, lots of shade, not a lot of flowers. Green and white were the color schemes down there. And now we're panning down the long lime walk. These are they're linden trees actually that line this lime walk that leads all the way down the holding the 2 ends of the gardens together. It was always called a lime walk because in Great Britain, linden trees are called limewood. So it was always known as a lime walk. And you'll see that in various places. It was very popular in England and the continent. And what you can't really see because of the very healthy foliage this year, but down on what we're looking at now is the French formal flower garden. So the formality and most of the flowers were actually down in the French formal flower garden. The high social season, by the way, in the Berkshires was, not surprisingly, September and October, because the foliage and the weather were so lovely. They were very sporting society. They had all kinds of horse shows and gymkhanas, and there was a racetrack around here as well. I think we're going to stop at the view right now and take a look at the view out the front, out off of the terrace, so to speak. We don't own quite as much land as the Whartons did, and they had land that went all the way down to Laurel Lake. Laurel Lake is now, you can't see it through the trees, but they actually had a lake view, so to speak. So our grounds, by the way, are open all the time, even in the winter. So even if the house is closed, the grounds are used by local people, and any visitors. You can wander the grounds all year round, as long as the weather allows it. So we are now going back into the house, and these shutters are original, by the way, and would have been used as shutters to block out the sun or the rain or the weather as necessary. And we are going to not stop for dinner and go straight upstairs. So now we're in the third floor hallway in Edith Wharton's personal suite. So we're going to look first at her boudoir, which is what we're walking into right now. Her boudoir comes from a French word meaning a place one can pout, where a woman can pout. So it meant a very private room where the woman of the house, so to speak, could get away from whatever it was that was bothering her. But you can see just from looking at it now that it's rather ornately decorated, one of the more ornately decorated rooms in the house. And that's because really, as Edith Wharton used it as an office, a private office. So it's a public room. She invites other people in here, maybe her editor, maybe a literary friend like Henry James, maybe a very personal friend. Her major servants would come up here. So it's a public room, but it's in a very private part of the house, and she would control exactly who would be in here. It is one of the most historically accurate rooms in the house. The colors are original. You might notice the round circles on the wall, or a repeat of the round circles that were used on the floors downstairs. These paintings, there are 8 paintings in this room. They are all still life, sort of Dutch 17th century style, very dark. Edith said she wanted to create an atmosphere that was pretty and gay in this particular room. We use this photograph, this historic black and white photograph, to recreate a lot of the details in this room. So this is one of the more historically accurate rooms, as I said, in the house. She wrote a lot of letters in this room. She was a great letter writer, and her letters have been published. So anyone who want to read her letters, I highly recommend it. This is a letter to George B. Dorr, who happened to be one of the founders of Acadia National Park. And he was a great friend. And so that is one of the things that she did in this room. She had some of her favorite men, or at least maybe her favorite men. These 2 pictures, we believe, are her husband, Teddy Wharton, with the dogs, as you can see. And then this picture over here on the far left is actually of Walter Van Rensselaer, that man she met in Bar Harbor when she was 21 years old. The toile, by the way, fabric that you've been seeing, was recreated from the original toile that she had. Dog bowl, very important. The dogs were everywhere. They had the run of the house. So this is a toile. French toile was very popular at the time. It's based on an Aesop's fable called The Miller and His Donkey. And I don't think I'll tell you the whole tale, but basically it's about a miller and his son who go to market with their donkey, and they make a series of very bad decisions, and in the end the donkey drowns. And the moral of the story is, if you try to please too many people too much of the time, you eventually lose your donkey. Or you can substitute the other phrase for donkey in there if you like. Note the mirrors. Again, mirrors are used throughout the house, reflection of light and air. That was part of her part of her philosophy. We move now to the bathroom. This is looking out her bathroom window. You can see she gave herself a terrific view. Most of the glass in this house is actually original. The wallpaper is a reproduction of the original wallpaper that was here, and about 80% of the glass is original as well. I'm going to skip to her bedroom. Her bedroom, along with the library, is probably the most important room in the house because this is where she wrote. These are actual manuscript pages from the House of Mirth, which she wrote in this room in 1905. Her habit was to lie her bed always faces east, so she would wake with the early morning light, not get dressed, not have to put on those terrible corsets, and she would write on an old-fashioned laptop desk, so to speak, old-fashioned type of laptop, a wooden desk with a fountain pen. So there's probably a lot of spilled ink here and there in the fountain pen. These are the portraits of her family that we talked about earlier. Her father is in the middle. And anyway, so she'd be writing until about 11 o'clock in the morning, and only then would she get up and start the rest of her day. So she became an extremely disciplined writer. She credits the House of Mirth with making her a professional writer. And of course, in her bedroom, we have to show one of her favorite things in the world, which is one of the last dogs she owned, a Pekingese called Linky. Linky died in France. Linky never lived at the Mount. She lived in France, but one of her best friends at the end of her life, a painter named Robert Norton, painted that for her. So again, you'll see the beautiful views she gave herself. She gave herself the best end of the house. From her bedroom, she could look over the gardens and the lake. From her boudoir, she could see who was coming in the front door. So it was mostly her money that built this house. So that is that she built this end of the house really with her own ability to not just for comfort, but also to write. Now that's another picture of her mama, Lucretia Rhinelander Jones. Edith Wharton did not own that portrait, so we don't know if she had a picture of her mother. She had a rather troubled relationship with her mother most of her life. And her mother died, ironically, the year Wharton built this house in 1902. These are call buttons. Let me just stop this one. All of the major rooms have these call buttons, and they are mother of pearl buttons that allow you to call your servant. So you can see here that this one even has the particular place that this is going to ring. The person that's going to ring. This is going to be the housemaid. This is going to be in the servants' hall. And so if you rang that, this is a picture. We went to the servants' hall to show you how that would ring. So it'd be Mrs. Wharton's boudoir would light up, or whatever from whatever she was calling you from. So now we have panned back out to the house. And if anybody has any questions, please send them into the chat, and Kathleen will read them to me, and I'd be happy to answer anything about the Mount or anything at all.
Yeah, that was fascinating. What an amazing tour you gave us. It's almost as good as being there. Would you mention the programs that are going on right now in the evening while I look for your questions?
Sure. So we just closed on October 31st for our daily visitation. We closed with a bang with a full weekend of ghost tours. Edith Wharton, I think I mentioned, was a great writer of ghost stories, and this house is haunted. So we have ghost tours that have just ended, and we're starting into our winter season, which is we're open on the weekends. The house is open on the weekends, Saturday and Sunday, until January 2nd, 10 to 3. And we're just starting tonight. We're having a dress rehearsal for a sound and light show called Nightwood. And Nightwood, we just started last year to great success. It's a walking tour. You walk through the grounds, and there are light and sound installations, and it's really quite magical. And so if you happen to be in the Berkshires or plan on coming up, please please do come in and visit us. And on our website is edithwharton.org, and you can find all the information on Nightwood about that from that.
That sounds like fun. Someone asked how long she lived there. I think you mentioned 10 years.
Of just under 10 years, actually. She moved there in they built the house in 1902, and they moved out in 1911, which is always kind of surprising. Again, they were going through difficult personal trials, that her marriage was really broken up, and that was one reason for it. One of my sort of theories is she loved the creative process. She loved creating this beautiful estate, and maybe after she created it, it wasn't quite as appealing to her. And I did actually, in the interest of time, leave out this little affair that she was having from about 1908 to 1910. She had this affair with a man named Morton Fullerton. He was an American, but the affair itself took place in Paris. So her attentions were elsewhere for a period of time. So she didn't stay here very long, which is always kind of surprising.
Someone was asking if on the fireback, was it Romulus and Remus?
That's what somebody suggested. Somebody else said there was some reason why it was not. But that was something that we had always believed it was. So I'm going to have to go back and do some research on that. Most of the firebacks, they're either biblical or fable or myth. She loved a myth. She loved a Greek and Roman myth. She hated fairy tales. She, even from a young girl, she said she didn't like fairy tales because they always had unrealistic happy endings. And if anybody has read any of her books, she did not believe in happy endings. She wanted to be realistic, and like most of her endings are quite ambiguous. So, but yeah, I thank you for that. We'll check in to see if it's Romulus and Remus, if we can tell.
Here's two questions that can go together. Did she intend divorce, and did they have any children?
They did not have any children. Scholars have differing views that they probably had very little, if any, marital relations. You can tell from her book, she writes a lot about unhappy marriages. They had dogs, as we always say here. They loved their little dogs. They would have, and they're always little dogs. They're Pekingese and Pomeranians and things like that. And yes, they did divorce in 1913. They sold the house. They argued a lot about the house. They finally sold the house in 1911. She actually, Edith Wharton, she made some good faith effort to try to keep the marriage together because the divorce was still not really acceptable. She offered to pay Teddy sort of an allowance for him to stay on at the Mount, and kind of, and she would go to France, and they would stay married, but they would be living separately. And Teddy didn't accept that. I think he thought he would be a kept man or something, which he was anyway. But so they argued a lot. It did get rather heated and a bit nasty at the end. And they sold the house, and she moved to France, and they got a divorce in France, a French divorce, in 1913. And one of the reasons they got a French divorce was because the French divorce proceedings were not open to the press and the public, and you didn't have your dirty laundry, so to speak, spilled out all over the place, and that was very important to her. But yeah, and that's also one of the reasons we think she moved to France and Paris, is that it was much easier to be a divorced intellectual woman in Paris in 1911 than it would have been in New York or in her own country. She would still have been ostracized as a divorced woman in her own country.
We have a question. Who spearheaded the restoration, and how was it funded?
Well, by the time I mentioned that the house had been owned by a theater company in the 1980s and 1990s called Shakespeare and Company, and they of course realized that the house was falling down and needed some help. So some of the organizers of the Shakespeare and Company, along with local historians and longtime Lenox residents, really wanted to save it. So they organized a group called EWR, Edith Wharton Restoration, Inc. And we were formed in 1978 and were able to purchase the property with help from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, but really couldn't do any major restoration. And it was still being used by the theater company to put on plays. So it wasn't until the late 1990s, specifically 1998, when there was or 97, there was a government program called Save America's Treasures. It was the Clinton administration, and Hillary Clinton came up around on a bus, and we, to our dubious honor, got the largest single grant of that particular program in this area, the $2.9 million grant from that program, matched or half matched by the Commonwealth, and then Massachusetts, and then the rest of that was private. Most of the rest of that was private donations. We had to fundraise like crazy. The major part of the restoration is estimated around 10 to 11 million, and another 2 or 3 million for the gardens, which were done right after the house.
Wow, what a wonderful, wonderful thing. Someone wanted to know if her decorating book would be current today.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Someone wanted to know if her decorating book would be relevant today.
It is certainly relevant to read, particularly if you're into design and decorating. A lot of she said would be, seen as very old-fashioned, but it was innovative for its day in terms of sort of turning away from the Victorian over excess. It's kind of funny because she talks about, Victorian style being overstuffed and over tufted. We look at some of the interiors from her time and we probably think, there's too much bric-a-brac. But I still find it really interesting to read today. You have to keep in mind that it is over 100 years old, but it was still taught in design schools, in many design schools, until quite recently. So yeah, I would say if you have an interest in that.
Interesting. We're coming to the end of our hour, but I'd like you to tell everyone the hours and the schedule from now until maybe next spring or into the summer, so people can come and visit.
So the hours now until January 2nd, the winter hours again, are the house is open from 10 to 3 on Saturdays and Sundays. And we have an online reservation system, which I encourage you to use because it makes things a lot easier for you and for everybody. But you can also just walk through as I said, the grounds are always open. If you don't want to go through the house or you're here on the weekday, you can walk through the grounds. Nightwood, that light and the sound and light program that I've been talking about, opens Thursday, November 4th, and runs until December 31st. It is Thursday through Sunday from 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock. And so if you're up here at all, that's a fun thing to do as well. And then we open full time again. The house usually opens the second weekend in May.
Sounds great. All right, I'll do one more question. Did any alumni from the girls' school at the Mount become prominent donors to the restoration? And how long was the school in existence?
Oh, great question. Yeah, Fox Hollow School for Girls was in existence from about 1942 to about 1976. And there were 30 or 40 girls who used the Mount as dormitory space. And there was another building, and the estate next door was also part of the school. And yes, they've been some of our strongest supporters. We have a Fox Hollow room in the servants' quarters of the house, actually one of the rooms that they would have slept in, which is filled with some of their memorabilia and scrapbooks and pictures and things like that. So they still come back. The last class would have been in 1976. We have reunions. And I do want to mention the headmistress of that school was a woman, English woman named Eileen Mary Farrell. And even though she didn't have a lot of money to do, a lot of restoration work herself, she was responsible for getting it listed on the Registry of Historic Places. And so that was really vital in terms of just that much protection. So she knew it was Edith Wharton's home. So apparently she was quite strict with the girls to make sure that they respected certain areas. So it was an important episode. And yeah, they are some of our best supporters and closest friends are the Fox Hollow.
That's lovely. What a wonderful treasure. It must be a pleasure to work there every day. I want to thank you so much for putting this together and sharing it with us. And we will be recording it so people can come to our website and see it probably in a week or so. And I strongly encourage everyone to make a trip and go up and see this beautiful home. And Anne, I'm so glad that you rejoined us in Darien.
Well, yes, I'm happy to return to Darien, even if virtually. So hopefully I'll make it down there one day.
Yep. Well, next time you come, we'll have a cup of tea.
Yeah, that would be great. So
All
thank
right,
you very
thank
much.
you.
I appreciate
Thank
it.
you, and good night, everyone. We'll see you soon.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.